All right. So
Well, sounds fairly harmless.
created a Google Drive with some of the best evidence for the superiority of the sword, or the usage of the sword at least, in battle. And this debate on the comments of this Age of Empires 4 video uh, starts off, as he says, with this comment. He says, the weapons they would have actually used for battle instead of polearms. Now, that's interesting because when we talk about battles, this is a quote from Wikipedia. 54% of the wounds suffered by French soldiers were inflicted by swords. Okay, these being the most common weapons on the battlefield, as everyone carried them as a sidearm. Okay, so this is Renaissance. This is after the relevant fact that we're talking time period that we're talking about. But I just want you to understand in your mind that in both Renaissance Europe, right, we're looking at people using swords, right, primarily. 54% of the wounds, that's the vast majority of the wounds, even assuming that gunners, gunners must have done a lot more work, right? They must have been responsible for at least 25%, but possibly more of the wounds inflicted. And then you have, wounds inflicted by spears, wounds inflicted by polearms. Uh, so the idea that the sword, because the sword's actually doing more than that, right? The sword's doing more than 50%. So even if we assumed that they're not using guns at all, the the majority, 54% of wounds are being inflicted by swords. So the idea that swords are not being used in battle in this Renaissance era context is completely incorrect. Now we can also talk about Romans, right? So the Romans, again, their primary weapon, gladius. Again, we're seeing a primary weapon being the sword, right? And the javelin or the pilum is being used as a throwing weapon. It's not being used as a primary weapon, right? It's a weapon you throw. Primary in the sense that you use it first and then you immediately switch to your actual weapon, that being the sword, And I think any the idea of calling, a weapon that inflicts 54% of the wounds a backup weapon, or just a weapon that's not very useful, is ridiculous to me. And this is relevant because, we're talking about the English, right? So, I mean, here's another one, right? At This is again from I'm not saying that name, and I'm not saying the name of that text, but you can see it on screen. Uh, With the Turks approaching, the Christians advancing against with great vigor, they fought from here to there. The bow did nothing, the lance very little, the sword did the most. So again, we have this, and this is from before the Renaissance. This is medieval period. This is they're basically saying, yeah, the sword's the most useful weapon we have. And again, the Turks wore armor. They weren't going into battle nude, so that completely debunks this whole argument that the sword is completely worthless against armor, because it's not. It's actually really good. Yeah, if you so one of the things that he consistently misrepresents when it comes to my argument is that he says, well, a sword can't go through a breastplate. Yeah, there's not a lot of melee weapons that can. A sword can't go through a helmet. Yeah, there's not a lot of melee weapons that can. At worst, they're going to get maybe a concussion, right? But instead, how you would use a sword is, again, like the techniques I mentioned, the half sword, uh, especially the half sword. You control your blade and you work it into either their armpit or their groin or their icelet or neck. And these are completely reasonable. These are covered in both, especially in Renaissance era treaties.
But you'll see this attracted the most toxic of all flies that you can imagine.
Thank you.
But before we open up this comment thread, I'd like to introduce you to said keyboard warrior, fighting out his false beliefs on the dung heap of the internet.
So I've already provided multiple pieces of text that completely prove you wrong, and you're going to call me wrong. Again, what can I say?
Mr. Sci-Fi Show, arguably the greatest keyboard warrior that has ever lived.
Thank you.
Not really, he only has 28 subscribers and 26 videos, but that's beside the point. Well, you see, the thing is, he made an entire video because he got triggered by my comment there.
Exactly. I hate when people make false claims on the internet, and your claim is one of the most commonly repeated myths on the internet to the point where even so called experts will repeat them, and it's just not true.
Which is like absolutely insane. But we'll quickly see that why he did that, because this Mr. Sci-Fi show is actually a slime ball. And
Oh,
as you can see, he got so triggered by my comments that he made an entire 14-minute video debunking, in quotes, my
well, I would argue it is debunking because I provided multiple pieces of evidence that prove my point.
video about medieval weapons and armor. So as you can see, this is the original comment. I just said that I wish they gave them pole arms. As you can see in AOE4, well, AOE4 is kind of a funny story. It claims to be, claims to care about history, but actually you'll see many ahistorical things.
I'm going to speed this up a
Uh,
bit.
One of them is, as we can see here, the samurai are using like the katana and the elite men at arms are using like sword and shield,
That's
which is
actually a
fine, but it's not
nodachi.
completely historical.
That's not a katana. It's a, well, technically yes, katana as a word just means sword, but when people talk about katanas, they're usually talking about a specific type of Japanese blade. That is a nodachi, and interestingly enough, in the early period before you upgrade these samurai, they start off with the naginata, I believe.
Accurate. But main battlefield weapons these heavily armored soldiers would use, well, you can see that the man at arms here is using probably full plate harness, and the samurai is using, armor like the yoroi and stuff. So the primary battlefield weapons they'll be using are pole arms, not sword and shield.
Again, that's just not true. Again, we have this text right here. The bow did nothing. The lance, aka the spear, did very little. The sword did the most. So, yes, these heavily armored units would be using swords.
They would have been secondary weapons. Pretty much throughout the medieval ages, swords have been
That's not true.
secondary weapons, sidearms, whereas the main battlefield weapons
Sidearm in the sense that, yes, it is by your side, because you can have a shield. You can have a primary weapon of some kind, be it a crossbow, be it a bow, be it a, you know, gun, even in the late medieval periods. But once fighting closes, you draw that sword. One of the interesting things I wanted to talk about is the pell mell, right? So when you get into close quarters combat, the infantry pell mell is called the I'm not saying that in or which translates directly to sword striking. So their word for melee combat is sword striking, right? And the reason it's called that is because you use swords.
the quote unquote assault rifles or machine guns of the medieval world would have been polearms like halberds and poleaxes.
I see this quote repeated all the time. And again, in a battle where 54% of wounds are being inflicted by a certain weapon, that being the sword, that is probably your primary weapon. Uh, just saying.
And stuff. But Age of Empires 4 has none of that. Nobody in this game, well, heavily armored soldiers.
Well, that's not true. Age of Empires has spearmen. Age of Empires has, all kinds of weapon units that have pole arms, and they made the correct decision to have pole arms be a specialized kind of anti-cavalry unit, and sword and shield, or swordsmen like the Landsknechts, like the the Zweihanders that many Landsknechts used as an anti-infantry weapon, and that's absolutely correct.
Actually use halberds, poleaxes, or anything. Spearmen line, they kind of do, but they're spearmen. But the actual heavily armored soldiers, like the men at arms and samurai, are using swords instead of things like halberds, poleaxes, yagi, etc. And I made this comment complaining about that.
You
So
keep
messing
saying that,
notice,
but it's
toxic
just not true.
productions. You guys can read the comments here. I've got a Jowsy accent or something like that. He's commenting about this, to which I replied, my issue is with the men at arms line itself. They use swords and shields as their primary weapons, whereas in reality they would have used heavy duty polearms that were effective against all types of armors. Things like
Like I said, later on in the video, he's going to show the quote that I provided, and he's going to try and debunk it. But again, you cannot debunk the quote because it's pretty clear.
Poleaxe, Beck, Corbin, likewise the samurai could have been given weapons like the different versions, variations of Yari, essentially Japanese halberds, etc., etc. And you can read. Now here's the deal. I Now here's the deal. I said
How would a man with a polearm have a AOE effect? Which area of effect, right? That doesn't make any sense. A polearm is not a weapon that you can use against multiple people. A polehammer, especially, not a weapon that you can use against multiple people. You transfer the kinetic energy into one enemy.
said they should use polearms as their primary weapons instead of swords and shields, which were in medieval times secondary weapons. That is, when you lost your primary battlefield weapon, it could get broken or it could.
Again, not true. So here's a quote from the Castilian knight Juan de Reo. I'm not going to say his first name because I'm going to butcher it. And you must hold your lance in your hand, placed in the pouch, setting off at a gallop, aim for the enemy's belly. Once the lance is broken, you shall take hold of the estoc, which is a type of sword, which should be strapped onto the left-hand side. When fighting with these weapons, strike at the visor and the voids. After you have lost or broken the estoc, you shall take hold of the arming sword, and then you shall take hold of your hammer, and then you shall use your dagger. Right. So we have this very clear hierarchy of weapons. Right. You use a lance. That's your shock charge. You splinter it on somebody's chest. They're going to die probably because it's a lance charge. And then you immediately go for your estoc. And then after that, you go for your arming sword. And then after that, you go for your warhammer. So the idea that the warhammer is some kind of really good anti-armor weapon is not true because, again, this Castilian knight is pointing out, hey, this is the way you're going to do things. Your most important weapon is your lance, then your estoc, then your arming sword. And when we say lance in this context, we're not talking about spears. We're talking about a very specialized weapon. And I know that's a bit confusing because in the very first quote I gave, it's talking about the lance in the sense of the spear, but this is 500 years apart, so definitions change.
Simply lose it or something, you would have used swords. They were sidearms, kind of like handguns to modern soldiers once they lose their assault rifles or whatever. But the video this guy made.
Again, that's a completely wrong argument. That's a completely wrong comparison because 54%, if there's a battle where 54% of your kills are by pistol, that's not going to make any sense, or wounds,
Completely misrepresents what I said, and he claims that I never said that medieval soldiers used swords and shields. Literally in the
Again, you had a problem with men-at-arms being depicted with swords and shields. That was you had a problem with that. You made a video about how you had a problem with that. Now, I agree. I do think that there should be a billhook unit, some kind of specialized anti-cavalry unit that you can use as the English to counter cavalry. Sure, that's fine by me. But the idea that they're not going to have men-at-arms is ridiculous. Or men-at-arms with swords and shields. Because, again, we have textual evidence that, yes, that is exactly what these guys use.
Comment I said as their primary weapons. As their primary weapons. And you might think, well, he looked at the first comment and thought that you were actually dismissing. No, he looked at all the other.
I mean, yeah, that's exactly what happened.
And he still creates this straw man.
It's not a straw man when your very first comment is instead of swords, right? Your argument is that swords wouldn't work, right? That's the second part of your argument, and the first part of your argument is they would have actually used for battle, right? Polearms is what they would have actually used for battle, right? Now, when you say that, you understand how that comes across as they're not going to use swords. The implication there is they're not going to use swords. And again, I have these texts, I have these quotes, and they show pretty decisively that, yeah, they did use swords.
But oh no, we'll actually see that this guy is a true piece of work. Now I'll scroll through the comments here, and you can see
hater,
and
hater,
then finally,
hateful.
Here he is. He claims that that's not true. English men-at-arms did use swords and shields. In fact, it's stated by contemporary historians that they trained with them more than they trained with longbows. The idea that swords are ineffective against armor is a myth.
It is a myth. Again, we have specialized techniques for dealing with armor, and a lot of these techniques are really good.
No, this is actually quite funny because, well, swords are kind of ineffective against metal armor. Decent metal armor would be impervious to sword slashes and stabs.
Yeah, the breastplate of an armor. See, you keep talking about how I'm strawmanning your argument, but I made it very clear that what I was talking about is getting around the gaps in the armor. Armor has gaps, and you can use a sword to get around them.
Tabs, starting from mail all the way to full plate harness. Essentially, swords wouldn't be that effective. Yes, you might be able to get some penetration off of swords in males, but for good quality plate armor, that's practically impossible.
We're not talking about going straight through mail or straight through full plate. We're talking about getting through the visor, getting through the armpits, getting through the groin.
So I called him out on his BS. In fact, the myth would be that swords can cut through armor like butter, as shown in the movies. He also claims that the English...
And that's a straw man. I never said that. I never said that swords could cut through armor like butter.
trained with swords and shields more than they trained with longbows. And I called him out on this. That is because swords were an expensive item. Pretty much nobles were the only ones who could...
And again, that's not true. The own quote that he provides, well, I should say the quote that I provide that he will look at says that all English men had swords. So the idea that swords are a weapon that's restricted only for the elite, not true. And again, we can look at the Romans. They managed to equip everyone that they had with the gladius, which is a type of sword, and we can look at the Macedonians. They had the, what is it called, the Xiphos or the Sarissa, uh, and the Greeks.
Could afford to buy swords. The peasantry got their swords as heirlooms or they stole from the battlefields generally. And so I called him
That's
out on
not
that.
true.
I replied, this is
Again,
absolutely
that's just not true.
nonsense. And then he claims maybe cite some sources and I'll take you seriously. Whereas he comes here and makes a claim that the English people, the peasantry, now this is ironic because he claims that the English peasantry trained with swords and shields more than longbows, whereas in reality, swords would not have been that affordable to the peasants anyways. And so I
That's
said just that. He's the one that
again,
didn't
that's
cite
just
anything in the
not
first place and
true.
made outlandish claims.
So, all right, well,
Now this is where
let's
the
just wait for him
misrepresentation
to
comes
get
in
to it.
really hard for this debate pervert. And you'll see quickly that this guy, Mr. Slimeball Show, was looking for any excuse just to humiliate me. He says swords are everywhere in
Yeah, I mean, that's the point of the debate. If you're going to come out and you're going to make a ridiculous claim like swords are only for the elite, I will absolutely humiliate you because you deserve to be humiliated for repeating that kind of lie.
medieval Europe. He talks about the Swiss pikemen using them, blah 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 blah, and he talks about the Battle of Arsuf. Now this is pretty much just fanfic about some Crusader king that he was using his sword.
Again, that's an actual quote from a medieval contemporary historian, a chronicler. So it's not a fanfic.
To everybody, like it was some sort of a lightsaber. This is like saying just because some medieval paintings depicted dragons mean that they somehow existed. Now I replied to this comment, but my comment get deleted.
No, it's a quote from a medieval chronicler describing a battle.
I replied by saying that swords were everywhere because they're made of metal, which helps preservation bias, and they're also a status symbol, expensive, and were commonly used by noblemen. Hence why the world sees this glorification of swords, whereas in reality, swords were, yes, they were good sidearms and were excellent self-defense weapons due to their nimbleness and ability to parry other weapons. However, my comment got deleted. And this guy is so insane that he didn't get the response from me that he expected, decided to egg on this conversation, and said, since I know you won't read the text I cited. Well, I did, and I replied, I debunked, but my comment got deleted. I'll quote it for you. And then he proceeds on to quote a description of English soldiers during the War of the Roses. And he quotes it up to clashing their shields with blunted swords or staves in place of swords. But he conveniently leaves out the second line. When they are older, they go out into the fields with bows and arrows.
Again, so you are kind of ignoring the first part, right? The very first part of the text says, there is hardly any without a helmet, none without bows and arrows. Their bows and arrows are thicker and longer than those used by other nations. They have blah, 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 blah. Range of their bows is no less. Their hangs by this is the important part, right? Their hangs by the side of each. So again, he's describing them in battle, right? This is not hunting. This is not anything like that. This is them in battle. Hangs by the side of each, a sword no less long than ours, but heavy and thick. Sword is always accompanied by an iron shield, right?
So what Muncini, the author, is really talking about is the English longbowmen, or the peasantry in general. And their primary weapon
Exactly. And he's describing them as being armed with swords and shields.
would have been the longbow and arrows, not the sword and shield.
Um, even the picture you provide shows a sword and a shield. So
As you can see, the English longbowmen would have the longbow as their main weapon, and the sword would be the sidearm, just like I said. They would have used it in close quarters combat.
exactly, they would have used it in close quarters combat. That's not a refutation. You're just admitting I'm right. I mean, okay. I promised I wouldn't get, too worked up this video, but you're gonna admit that I'm right, and then you're gonna try and like say that I'm wait. Okay,
Combat, but their main weapon was the longbow and arrows. And what's annoying is that he takes the word of these medieval writers more seriously than actual experts. So I called him out on.
yes, I absolutely would. Modern experts, a lot of modern experts, and I say experts in quotation marks, a lot of these people are not historically literate. They don't read the sources, and they come to conclusions based on the LARPing that they do. And, well, the LARPing that they do, right? What are the rules for the LARPing that many of them do, right? I saw this one video where it was, I don't remember who it was, but they were trying to make a video about how spears are better than swords, and they have these guys, and the idea is if you get tapped once by the spear, you're out of the game. That's not how realistic medieval combat worked.
On that. But in his video, he will skip some of my comments and create a straw man that he can burn with his toxicity. And then in the same comment, I start talking about experts in the field, who are not armchair historians like Mr. Slimeball Show here. I suggested him checking out the words of medieval weapons and armor experts and HEMA practitioners, such as Toby Capwell, Matt Easton, Ian Lispina. And his reply is, HEMA experts don't make me laugh. Their entire job is not killing each other. Yeah, as if you need to murder people with a shotgun to really understand what it can do. So he's clearly not the brightest bulb in the night here. No.
Again, a lot of these misconceptions are stemming from medieval, reenactors and HEMA, quote, well, HEMA, right? when you talk about HEMA, uh, they're constrained, right? You cannot use the sword to stab directly into someone's visor in HEMA. So they're just hitting each other with pole arms, and they go, well, pole arms must have been the primary weapon. Well, no, you can't kill the other guy with a pole arm. You know, you're gonna move in with the sword and grapple and kill him.
Now, for those who want to actually check out the matter, here's a compilation of experts talking about what were primary weapons in the battlefield and what were effective against armor.
Obviously, a sword represents knighthood, and for us still today, the sword is arguably the quintessential knight's weapon. But probably on the battlefield, they've been using a poleaxe, or a mace, or other kind of percussion weapons. The problem is, a sword is relatively light, it's very sharp, it's got a point, it doesn't do much damage against a man in harness. So if you have plate armor, you can't cut through, no matter what the movies say, you can't cut through plate armor with a...
Again, that's not what I was saying. I wasn't saying cutting through plate armor. I was saying putting the sword through a visor, which is, again, something that was trained for. You can look at Fior's Flower of Battle, right? What does he write? The sword is the king of weapons. The sword is the best weapon. Again, that's from Fior. And he says, no weapon against me can do well because it's the best weapon. And that's a Renaissance era expert right there talking about how, and these are people that have actually killed people, right? When we're talking about this guy, right, he hasn't actually killed anyone. He hasn't actually gone into battle with the intent to kill someone else. He's hitting someone with a pole hammer and going, oh, that doesn't kill him. That must be the weapon that they used.
blade. It's just impossible.
So one-handed swords principally were used throughout this entire period for 1,000 years, and the lance was really the primary weapon, so the sword was the backup to the lance.
History kind of backs up my point here, because if you think about it, the main weapon of a samurai, for example, if you want to move to Japan, was either the yai or the naginata, so the polearm. Secondary weapon, the bow. Third weapon, the katana.
The difference in use between these two is the...
I would disagree with that assessment entirely. We have texts, right, from and I really do wish I had watched this video and gone through it bit by bit. I didn't have the patience to do it, but we do have texts from unit compositions described by the daimyo, and they would generally have about 25 to 30% spearmen, right? Men armed with polearms. And the remainder would be guys with guns. And their backup weapon, in that case, would be the sword.
The circumstance of armor development. At the time of the Danax, the best armor you could get was mail. And with this, of course, you have plate armor, depending on the exact time period, anything from plate combined with mail to a full-on pseudo-plate where mail is really only used for the gaps as voiders. And this has some pretty significant implications. For one, this, of course, is the response to such highly developed armor. You want to be able...
I do not revere Scalagrim, and I think Scalagrim is completely wrong when it comes to polearms as a primary weapon. Again, you're not going to see a battle where the primary weapon is not doing 54% of the wounds. The sword is doing 54% of the wounds, right? Not the pike, not the halberd, it's the sword. That's the majority. Even if you want to say, oh, every single other weapon injury was inflicted by a pike or a halberd, well, no. That's still only 46%. And again, the guns are going to do a lot more than that. Like a lot more than 0%, obviously.
Able to do more damage to the armor, either with strikes, be able to hammer side of it, or with a point and thrusting into the gaps of the armor. And it's also quite useful for grappling. And at the same time, it's also for use in armor, because now you can carry a two-handed weapon on the battlefield while being much safer than you would have been in earlier times. If you think about the presence of arrows and javelins and various other projectiles on the battlefield, carrying this is quite a significant risk if you don't use a shield. Aren't really necessarily all that underrated. Sure, they also typically get less attention than swords, but they're not quite as chronically overlooked as axes, I would say. If you look at history, this is the weapon. Weapon number one, especially on the battlefield. And especially...
Again, 54%. And again, you're coming at me with explains why shields were redundant for heavy soldiers. Again, the very text that we cited, right? The text that we're looking at tells us directly that, hey, these guys had shields. By the side of each is a shield and a sword.
Over large periods of time.
So as you can see, guys, even Scholagrim says that in the context of a battlefield, polearms such as the spears were the primary weapons. Poleaxes and other heavy-duty polearms, like Bectecormans, Bectefaucians, etc., great anti-armor weapons. They had hammerheads and a lot of leverage, which could allow them to bypass armor. Scholagrim agrees with me. So this was my response to his, and don't you dare talk down to me again, and I mentioned the experts in the field who know more than me and know what they're talking about. But he didn't see my previous comments because they got deleted, and I explained to him. Now, I don't know why my comments got deleted, but I wouldn't put foul play above.
I think it's the reason that they're getting deleted is probably when we type them out and YouTube sees us, being mad at each other. It deletes the comments to try and get us to cool off. That's my guess. My comments are getting deleted too, so
of him or anything. To
Whatever.
be fair, he also complains that his comments also got deleted. So who actually knows? He disrespects the actual experts in the field, but to his credit, he does know something. Like if you're using a sword against full plate harness, you would want to stab in the gaps in between. However, the people who can afford full plate harness would have their arming doublets lined with mails in those gaps to provide extra protection. These are called voiders. And here's an example showing how effective chainmail or mail is against swords.
See, that's a slash. It's not a pierce. Mail is not good against piercing attacks. You know, if you there's a difference.
See, you guys spent so much time talking about the legendary power of the samurai katana, and it was just stopped in its tracks by the Viking chainmail.
Like this. So besides a few nicked chainmail rings, there's absolutely no damage here.
So even if you did manage to get into the gaps, there is a good chance that it wouldn't be so effective. In conclusion, swords aren't that great against most good armor. Hence why we see maces, warhammers, and heavy...
All right, again, just to repeat myself, the warhammer is put at the very bottom next to the dagger. So, whatever.
polearms, poleaxes, halberds, bectacordons, etc. dominate the battlefield. Even anti-cavalry polearms such as bills and other things. But he just won't admit that, and claim that swords are still better.
Because they are.
So our special friend insults me and HEMA experts in one sentence and under the same breath claim, why do you think techniques like half sorting are more helpful? Maybe ask HEMA experts whom you disrespect so much. The reason is because, again,
it's a rhetorical question. Obviously, I understand the answer, and the answer is they're useful against armor.
Against armor, sword blades aren't that effective. So
you might take it out of context and say, huh, they used katana, they didn't thrust, so we don't know. Actually, there's a blow with a katana called the suki, which I believe it's called the suki, and it is a thrust. Now, the katana is not great at thrusting, but you can thrust with it.
to make up for that, you need to create a makeshift mace or bludgeoning weapon. Swords have most of their weight at the hilt, and so by half sorting and using techniques like Mordhau or the murder stroke, things which this guy clearly doesn't know about, you can...
Again, you're saying that I don't know about these techniques, but I mentioned both of them, half sorting and Mordhau.
You need to create a makeshift mace or bludgeoning weapon. Swords have most of their weight at the hilt, and so by half sorting and using techniques like Mordhau or the murder stroke, things...
The point is to show the flexibility of the sword. You can use it any way you want. You can, come up with the Mordhau to strike, and it's still effective, right? I mean, that's kind of the bonus of a longsword is it's a better warhammer. You can use it both for thrusting and for smashing, depending on what the context requires. With a warhammer, some of them will have a spike at the end, but that spike is since it's at the end of the weapon, and the warhammer is weighted, so all the weight's at the tip of the weapon, or most of it, it's not as effective as using a longsword for thrusting. Now, a warhammer might be better than a longsword at delivering concussive force, but at the end of the day, again, the real historical knights said that, hey, this is a weapon that's your backup for your backup. Your arming sword's better.
Which this guy clearly doesn't know about. You can actually use the sword
I mentioned both of them, so how would I not know about them?
as a makeshift mace. But you know what's actually better than a makeshift mace? A real mace, and make it two-handed, with a lot of leverage and power. And heavily armored soldiers wrestle so that...
The problem with the Kanabo and other large maces, two-handed maces that he's talking about, is because they're so slow, right? They're so slow to recover. You cannot use them effectively in a defensive context. It's essentially a weapon where I'm going to put all my luck, essentially, into hoping this attack goes through. What happens if that attack gets blocked? What happens if that attack gets dodged? Well, then you're completely boned, because the guy with the sword is going to close to grappling distance, and he's going to have you by,
that they would pin their opponents down and use daggers on their eye slits and other gaps. That would ensure instant death. Then he says the closest that he will grant me is that English did use billhooks. Yeah, only billhooks. And then, although only for pulling a knight off of his horse, the finishing blow would be, of course, blah, 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 blah. It's really insane. Then I start making fun of him. As I showed, trolling him should have been better. I talk about half sword and literally put a hand uncomfortably on the blade. Now, at this point in the video, I started debunking his claims one by one in the video, but unfortunately, I realized that my desktop audio wasn't turned on, so yeah, the viewers can't really hear what he's saying. And to be honest, I don't have the patience to go back through that entire video again. But the gist of it is, he continues his straw man from the comment section and keeps on repeating the same point. And I'll give you the gist of his video. If you guys still don't believe me, feel free to watch his video. Oh, anyways, but I'm not going to be posting it. I don't want to be giving that loser the attention that he craves. So I pretty much just...
That's so funny. I don't know. I don't know. It's just the fact that he's so mad about this debate. Now, it did piss me off, right? It did piss me off that he's coming at me, acting like he knows more than me, repeating all these myths that are just objectively not true. Now, he can bring up all the experts he wants, but the point is, the medieval people, right? The people that wrote about combat, they wrote about the sword, right? And after this video, I will go
This talks
through
about why swords were
the
everywhere,
quotes
even
I've
the conservation
compiled.
biases I debunked already, and that they were a status symbol for the knights and other noble people.
Again, that's not true. We know for a fact that almost everybody had a sword. We can go through. They carry shorter lances. Indeed, the French seem more suited for the sword. Again, wavering in fear, drew their swords. Ringing of swords. Quarreled with swords, ringing about their heads. Uh, Drawing a sword. Da 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 da. It will come to swords. So again, so I did have a text for Metatron's quote. Again, yes, primary weapon bow, not the spear, and then when they run out of arrows, it will come to swords. Again, not spears. When men at arms are armed with white, that being full plate, and use heavy arms, they above all weapons they use stocks. Above all weapons, including the lance, all weapons, right? And what is in a stock? It is a type of sword. Okay, so again, we have another piece of evidence that hey, these